In a world filled with sharks, bears, and killer bees, one man is brave enough to stay indoors to bring you the latest in gaming, movie, and pop culture news. That man is Tom Awesome, and this is the Outside is Overrated podcast.
Hello and welcome to Outside is Overrated, a grown-up podcast about gaming and nerd pop culture. We discuss video games, books, TV shows, movies, and board games. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Tom Sedlacek, and we've got a great show lined up for you. Tonight, we're breaking down the animated film Macross, Do You Remember Love? This film redefined mecha anime, and 40 years later, we're going to discuss, does it still hold up? Joining me for the discussion today are Dr. B, Brian Camille.
Hi, everybody.
And not a doctor like me, John Munch.
Howdy, howdy.
Welcome to the show, guys. John, you haven't been on the main show since our Baldur's Gate 3 episode. You have since completed the game. Is there anything you'd like to add as an addendum to that episode?
Go buy Baldur's Gate 3. Even if you don't like role-playing games, buy it if you're a fan of like awesome studios and fun, right? They keep patching it. Like they just released patch 8 or it's coming out soon for different areas, and they're releasing like subclasses. They were able to like get like split screen on the Series S, which is super impressive. So just, you know, if you like good game studios and good games, buy Baldur's Gate 3.
Brian, is that enough of a recommendation for you to go buy Baldur's Gate 3?
The wife, Kelsey, has been harassing me about it because she's heard that it is a lot of fun. So that is a game she wants to play 2-player. Well,
Brian, why don't we play Couples Z 4-player?
That will consume us.
Why don't we play Couples Z 4-player, dude?
Is that a thing? Can we do that?
Yeah, I don't know if Kelsey and Phoenix will need PlayStation Network subscriptions or not, but I know that you can play 4 players online.
If you are willing to do the legwork on figuring it out, yeah. I'm romancing Tom right away. That's my first thing. I'm charisma check Tom.
All right, I'm going to be Shadowheart. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll do the legwork as long as you guys commit to playing after 9:30 p.m. when our children are asleep. Everybody wins, right?
I can make that deal.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I've seen what time you play Marvel Rivals. Hey, last month you were all about Marvel Rivals. Are you still all about Marvel Rivals?
I still am. Now I'm playing Comp, which is a lot harder. I'm learning that I don't understand necessarily where I should be positioned-wise a lot of the time, so it's a slog. I think last night I played with a group of 4. We went 1-5, and the last group was the best team we've ever encountered. My entire team had 1 kill. We just got stomped, so there is definitely a whole bunch of humble pie being consumed over at the Camille household right now.
Yeah, that's like your favorite meal, isn't it? So compared to last time when we discussed the bots, how do you feel about the bots now, Brian, after your 1 and whatever match?
Scott and I, friend of the show, Scott, I don't know if he's enough on Patreon to be called a friend of the show, but Tom will tell me later, depending on what's in the bank account. Scott and I were playing the other night, and we're like, yeah, we're doing really well. Halfway through the match, Scott's like, these are bots, aren't they? I'm like, yeah, I think these are bots. We looked up the match afterwards. Yeah, they were bots. So it's still, I really kind of wish it wouldn't happen. I understand why they do it, but the bots are so mindless. It just kind of feels like you're wasting time shooting at, like, you know, stupid targets that are just going to stand there and eat it.
So, John, are you like Brian and just hate having fun, just blasting some bots, or what?
I don't care. Human or bots, if it's fun, right?
Yeah,
you know.
Like I'm playing Ghost of Tsushima right now. That's filled with bots, and like it's great.
Yeah, it's the same approach John has to his love life.
John's been married for a very long time.
Fun and winning? Okay. All right. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen John's children, so like there's proof of John's love life.
He was the lead singer in a band. He's got swagger.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought
actually, he picked her up at a bar. She was a waitress as he was singing there. And I kid you not, that is a love tale of time.
Yeah, John, do you want to elaborate on that at all?
I mean, that's all it is, right?
Oh,
when you're a good-looking lead singer, what you can do.
Yeah, things come easy, right?
Your life.
Yeah, speaking of good-looking lead singers, we'd like to thank our sponsor, Premier Health. Check out their website at premierhealthmn.com. That's premierhealthmn as in Minnesota.com. Brian loved that transition. It's written all over his face. You can support the show at patreon.com/OiO. You can back the show for as little as $2 a month and help us out with all of our expenses that come along with providing this entertainment. You can also follow us on social. Email the show at overratedpod@gmail.com. That's overratedpod@gmail.com. Follow me at ThompsonLogicOIO on most platforms, and follow the show at facebook.com/outside-is-overrated. So if you haven't listened to the Shogun episode yet, we introduced a new concept in that episode, the OiO drinking game. So anytime I mispronounce a word or a name, take a drink of whatever is in front of you. So I have learned over these last 2 months that I am not fluent in Japanese language. So like there are a lot of things that I'm going to really struggle with this in this show, and that's not just because I mispronounced Macross on the very first reference, right? So like bear in mind the OiO drinking game as we launch into this. Macross, Do You Remember Love is an animated film that debuted July 7th, 1984 in Japan. It was directed by Shoji Kawamori and Noboru Ishiguro. It is not generally available in the United States, making it a perfect topic for a media podcast. This is the first time that we've discussed mechs on Outside is Overrated. When I first pitched this episode and asked you both to suggest media that we could cover for it, Brian, you came back with this film, Macross, Do You Remember Love? Why do you have an affinity for this film?
Just as an addendum to what you said, it is available. If you go on YouTube, you will find this pretty quick. So anybody that has a YouTube app, you can enjoy the whole thing in 4K. Have fun. In ninth grade, I had moved away from Mora, Minnesota, and I was living in a new city. I didn't make a lot of friends, and I spent a lot of time by myself. And fortunately, during that time, I discovered anime. And Akira and Wrath of the Ninja were two of the first things I ever watched. And somehow, I don't know how, but my mom had talked to, she's a lab tech worker in a clinic. She had chatted with one of her coworkers, and it turns out he was a massive anime fan. And this guy, I don't even know if I ever got his name, but he wound up making a dupe on a VHS of Macross, Do You Remember Love? And I remember watching it, and I was blown away just by the amount of detail. Akira is this way too, but it was just like such an extreme amount of like high action detail that was going on in the show, and I thought that was just amazing. This guy was kind enough that when he went to Japan, he brought back a Dragon Ball Z manga for me. Now, in ninth grade, I don't even think Dragon Ball Z had hit our shores yet, and they were already in the Cell Saga. I don't know who this man is. I never got his name. Maybe I'll ask my mom to see if she can even remember who it was. But like this unknown benefactor wound up actually providing some really cool memories for me. And I really didn't know the place in history this show had until we were researching it now. And I realized that I had actually watched, some people consider a staple of anime in certain ways, and I didn't even know. So it's kind of cool to look back and go, I got a taste of something that is really important to the history of this kind of progression of the culture. And I didn't know what I had, but I got to experience it with no kind of prejudices or anything like that. And I really appreciate the fact that I got to come back to it 30 years later, which makes me feel so old, but it's really cool.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. John, I've never spoken with you before. Are you an anime fan or what?
So I have like long, since high school, right? And since the day of going to Suncoast Video, and that was the only place you could get tapes, right?
Expensive.
You're going down to Suncoast, you're going to Spencer's, you're going to find something, right? And you're spending $30 on one tape for 6 episodes, right? Like dating ourselves here, and that's kind of where I got introduced to this, and I actually was introduced to Macross through Robotech, which there's a whole, it gets really crazy when you look at what Robotech is in the Macross universe, because it's basically, Macross didn't make it to the shores until Robotech. Robotech came over, right, serialized, but there wasn't enough meat on the bone, right, for it to be like a full, serialized TV show. So, they, mixed 3 animes together, and it got really, really confusing. And I watched it all out of order, borrowing it from tapes, from friends, and this and that. So it was really cool to come back and rewatch this, because I know I'd seen this movie at some point in time, and just rewatch this and oh, okay, now I understand what an OVA is, right? And how it's just the whole series wrapped up in a 2-hour movie. So it's cool to kind of go back and watch this again with that knowledge.
John, is Robotech and Macross the same thing? Is that the American name of it?
Robotech is the American name, right? So The reason why Macross is not available in the U.S. until just recently, right, was because of the rights of how Robotech was formed, right? So basically, an American company, and I can't remember the names, Harmony Media or something along the lines of that, they had the rights to Robotech, right? And they wanted to make the toys and this and that. So they had the rights to Macross, in the U.S. And because of that, and because they tied it in with these other two animes, flesh it out and make it actually really long and serialized, so they could have it playing on TV during the day, right, for kids. It didn't make any sense, but the rights never got pushed back to the company that released it in Japan. So the actual every time they're putting on a 4K release, it's out in Japan, but they couldn't push it out in the US because this other company held the right. Right, so there's this big, huge legal battles, and now the rights have reverted back to the original company, right? And that's why everything but the Macross saga and Do You Remember Love is now available on Disney Plus and Hulu, right? But Macross and Do You Remember Love won't be, because they are still lumped under the Robotech saga in the U.S. So that's why you have to go to YouTube or get a Japanese Blu-ray.
And a quick clarification, I don't believe that Macross is available on Disney Plus in the U.S. I believe it is on Disney Plus in all regions outside of the U.S.
It is now available. The original Macross saga, not available anywhere in the U.S.
Yep, I looked it up too. There's a whole bunch of them on there.
Anywhere in the U.S. because those things are tied to Robotech. But Macross Plus, Macross 7, Macross Delta, all the new Macross sagas, which are independent, right? You can watch them, you can watch Macross 7 and it's a whole new story. They have kind of similar through lines with the ships and with there being teen idol and love story triangles. But those are now all available, and you can watch them on Hulu/Disney in the US.
Well, that was a very deep dive. Now that we've chased everyone off of the episode, let's set some expectations for what we're going to discuss. For me, my entire anime experience has been chronicled on Outside is Overrated. We did a Gateway to Anime show where we watched Cowboy Bebop and Full Metal Alchemist and Princess Mononoke, I believe, was the film that we watched with that one. So this was all of anime is a new experience for me. I had never seen this. I had no idea what it was, and I was thrilled that I had to look up a thing that was subtitled on YouTube. I don't support pirating media, but I couldn't find a copy that I could watch in the US. So here's what we're going to discuss about Macross, Do You Remember Love? We're going to talk about a brief history of Mech-kind. We're going to explain what exactly Macross is. We're going to ask, is Do You Remember Love a film worth watching in 2025? And then we're going to talk a little bit about our favorite mech media. This kicks off 2 months of mech mania here on Outside is Overrated. We are playing Armored Core 6 Rise of the Rubicon in March and April on our Game Club segment. And then next month, we'll talk about mechs in a digital board game format. I think that mechs are interesting because they predate modern pop culture, and I've had almost no exposure to them. You can trace the history of mechs all the way back to the novel The Steam Man of the Prairies, which published in 1868 by Edward S. Ellis. It features a steam-powered mechanical man. The novel Metropolis from 1927 introduced the iconic robot Maria, hinting at future depictions of mechanical constructs. Then fast forward to the late 70s and early 80s, and you saw the rise of real robot mechs, which were grounded in military and technological realism. Mobile Suit Gundam in 1979 pioneered this approach, treating mechs as military weapons in a war-driven narrative. This led to a wave of mech-heavy anime, including Macross in 1982, known in the US as Robotech, Pat Labor, it looks like Pat Labor, in 1988,
5 times,
and Votoms in 1983. These series influenced Western audiences, particularly through syndicated cartoons and toy lines. And the mech genre found a place in Western media through franchises like Transformers in 1984, which emphasized sentient robots. Did I miss anyone? Did I miss anything important there?
The first one, the very first one is called Mazinger Z. It came out in 1972. It was like the first mech that was like piloted by a human. So, I'll talk about my interaction with that one, which I didn't even know that I had. Do we define mechs as pilotable or anything that's a big robot? Like, let's get this clear first before we jump into this.
Yeah,
I feel like it should be piloted, right?
Yeah, it should be piloted. So Transformers aren't technically mechs, but they're robots that change into things. So, and it was
they're
my
mech
like
adjacent. Mech adjacent is where they're at, and there are mechs in Transformers, and we'll talk about that later. Transformers themselves are
awesome. One of you made an anonymous note in the show notes to not forget Power Rangers. So I'm not forgetting about Power Rangers either. So thanks for that note.
That was mine, just because it was funny that in the 90s that came out, and like it randomly popped in, like, oh yeah, that's just like another version of Voltron, essentially. I had forgotten. I was like, oh, and it's still popular with kids, which is funny.
That's wild. Then you have video games like Armored Core, which debuted in 1997, and Zone of the Enders from 2001, which gave players a chance to live the power fantasy of piloting mechs. So given that mechs are popular worldwide, John, what is your appetite for mech content?
I think we need more, right? Like giant robots are Transformers, the Iron Giant, right? So what can be even cooler than those things, right, is me being in the giant robot, me being the giant robot. Like, I was a Voltron kid. I love that remake that came out on Netflix. Front Mission back in the day, right? So like watching this and like thinking about mechs just kind of brings me back into that space. You know, I've always been more like fantasy focused, but it's been fun to kind of dive back into like the 80s where this was such a huge like movement, was this big thing, and didn't, not really realizing how much of my kid brain picked it up.
Bry Guy, what about you?
It's funny, John, that you mentioned that, because a lot of it was about the toys, right? Like, every single one of these things, these series lived and died by toys. If they couldn't produce a toy line, it just didn't stick around, particularly some of the Japanese stuff that came in. When I was doing the research for the show and I was going through like the history of like, all of these different video games from like, or shows from like Giganto, which was like the 1960s and kind of all the way up, I ran into Mazinger Z, which is this big, goofy kind of knight-looking robot, which my parents bought for me in the late 80s, and it had like missiles it could shoot out of its hand. It was this big, stupid-looking thing. But I'm like, I own that. It's like that Pamela Anderson conversation we had before. It opened up this little corridor in my brain, and I'm just like, oh my god! I'm like, I remember this. And that came out in like 1972, so that predates Gundam a little bit. But I think Tom was very accurate when he said Gundam, like Gundam set the table. This stuff before was just kind of figuring it out. Gundam like set it. And then just like John had mentioned, Transformers was not really a big thing for me, unfortunately, but Voltron was. I love the Lions. I love like them transitioning and turning into Voltron. I love like the monster of the week battles and the mutants and the creatures that would fight the burning blade, and they'd cut it in half and it was dead. It was the same episode every time, but like it was, I was happy to always watching it. And then when I was in college, we watched, if John and I together, we'd watch Big O. If you remember Big O, the animation style was super cool, big, gigantic, almost like steampunk kind of mechs that was fun to watch together. And then, oddly enough, one of the fraternity members named Dan Chalk, John would know Dan. Dan owned Steel Battalion, which was an Xbox game. And Tom, do you know anything about this?
Nope.
It is absurd. It comes with a 40-button control panel. It was like a $200 thing to buy. You got 2 joysticks and like 40 buttons, and everything worked. So you had to like pilot the mech as you played. It was just the most absurdly difficult thing to play, because it was literally like you were running a space station. But it was kind of neat to have the full-on mech experience.
Which, like, it was so difficult. Like, there was a launch sequence. Like, if you push the wrong buttons, you would like eject yourself out or blow up the mech, right? So it was like as real as it could be, which I find hilarious, right?
Perhaps too much.
Giant thing as big as my desk, right? And like, I spent all this money, and what have you done? Well, can't get it started because I can't push the buttons right, and I keep blowing, right?
Yeah, I hit Elf Destruct. I was worried about these elves, and now I'm dead. I don't know what's going on now.
I mean, that just doesn't sound fun. And I'm on a different end of the spectrum for you guys. I've never had an affinity for giant robots, like, ever. Like, I had Transformer toys, and that was basically it. My entire gateway to Mech-kind is FromSoft making Armored Core 6. It's like, FromSoft does a mech game, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, I should check this out. And I grabbed it from the library. I'm like, oh, this is freaking awesome. How do I work this into a show? And now, here we are. We're going to play Armored Core for Game Club, and we're discussing a mech anime film.
Technically, you and I back in 2016 did an episode on Metal Gear, and Metal Gear 5. The gears themselves, the Metal Gears, those are mechs. They're pilotable mechs. So you had a little bit of a taste, little bitty taste right there. You didn't know.
All right, great. So my entire appetite is FromSoft and Metal Gear Solid and 5. So it's a huge frame of reference. I'm going to have some very educated and very pointed opinions about this film. Brian, like, what was your very first memory of mech content?
Probably Voltron. Probably. I mean, if you count Transformers, it'd be Transformers, but like it was Voltron, and Voltron was tough because as in the late 80s, early 90s, like it was hard to find anime content or like mech content because a lot of it was coming out of Japan, and it really wasn't consistent on TV. It was really hard to find some of these shows, and sometimes you'd find a show and it wasn't on very long and it was just gone. And most of the dubbing was absolutely atrocious. But I remember watching Voltron and being amazed at just the action sequences. And I had never seen where, like, you know, it's the 5 things that come together to create the big mech and you win. And I really thought that was so cool. And I remember my mom had dated a gentleman, and one of his kids, Tanner Anderson, he's a friend of mine from back in the day. Tanner had some of the Voltron toys, and so you could put them all together, and I was so jealous. But I remember it being actually really expensive to get because everything articulated. And that's probably the first stuff that comes to my mind right away. And RoboJocks, which John will bring up later. I remember seeing that as a kid on a video cassette going, what is this? But no one would rent it because I only had sisters.
Yeah, life is hard. John, what about you?
So like my earliest memory really is like being like 5 or 6. I remember being real young and renting the Transformers movie. And there's a scene in there where Daniel Witwicky gets in the exo suit, right? So basically he gets to be a Transformer. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's cool. What is this thing, right? Like the kid actually gets to be in this suit, transform, shoot lasers, right? It's awesome. So that's always stuck with me. And then like, you know, Voltron, right? Like the bits and pieces I saw of it when I could see it. Remember I had a Voltron board game as a kid that like, you know, we did not play by the rules, didn't understand it at all, but like you eventually got to be Voltron in the end. So it was cool. I don't know. But like that's where it all started. Yeah.
Transformers for me. And like, you know, it's interesting thinking back. Like I have a very crystal picture in my head of when I fell in love with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It was literally the first time that I watched the cartoon, because I remember seeing kids like playing with the action figures on the playground. I'm like, oh, well, that looks stupid. You got little turtles. Dumb. And then like I get off the bus, I get my snack, I start watching, and like the opening sequence, just the action in it, I'm like, oh, all right. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are awesome. And like I can't think of another like IP from my childhood that has that crystal a memory of when I fell in love with it.
I feel like for our age, right before us was the Transformer kids and the G.I. Joe kids. And then we hit of age right when it was Turtles. Because John, you're 2 years older than us?
A little bit older, yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like John was like probably just a little bit of that Transformers. And because I remember when we grew up in Mora, Turtles were everything. There was really nothing else. It was just everywhere. And we were in a small rural town. That was nuts.
Yeah, Turtles and then the Batman animated series. But I digress. Let's dive into Macross. Let's dive into Macross. Drink, folks. Do you remember love? So, what is Macross? Macross was an animated series for adults in Japan. It initially strove to be a romantic comedy played out across an interstellar war. It was a groundbreaking series that featured militaristic or realistic military sci-fi mechs, a love triangle with a strong character focus, and the unique concept of music as a weapon. The film that we are discussing, Macross Do You Remember Love, is a retelling of the main events of the series with higher animation quality, refined storytelling, and more cinematic depth. Do You Remember Love follows humanity aboard the space fortress Macross. We are caught in a war between two alien races with the warlike Zentradi and their female counterparts, the Meltrandi. Drink. Pilot, Hikaru Ichuju becomes entangled in a love triangle between pop idol Lin Minmay and officer Misa Hayase. We eventually discover that music is the key to uniting humanity and ending the war. So there's a recap of the film. John, going back to this film, what elements of it stood out to you?
The first thing that was just the kind of classic, right? This is staple 1980s anime, and just how they shift from this crazy melodrama, right? And we're kissing and Hiriku's looking at Minmay and with the lovey-dovey eyes, and then 5 minutes later you're smashing and blowing up as Andrade's head and guts are blowing everywhere. So I think that stuck out with me right away when I was watching.
And it's interesting that you reiterate that this is classic 80s anime. It occurs to me right now, I have never watched an anime from the 80s. The oldest anime I have ever seen was Dragon Ball, and I specifically started with the Cell Saga. So that is the oldest anime prior to this that I had ever watched.
Yeah, it's just hand drawn, right? To me, I kind of relate it to watching a classic and then watching something that's a little bit more modern, right? So this is the animation from the 80s, a little darker, a little grittier, right? It's your Secret of Nim, right? Moments in there where you're this is not for kids, right? Moments that just I loved it. It was great.
And Brian, going back to this film after 30 years, I don't believe you'd watched it since high school. What stands out about this film today in 2025?
Last time I watched this, I was 14. So it's been a bit. I'm 42. So there's been a little bit of a gap here. First, what John said, it's all hand drawn. And the part that's so crazy to me is the level of detail that they get, considering that these are individual cells, and the amount of detail that they have with that is absurd. Even when you go to the kind of end fight scene of the show, and just the amount of ships on the screen, and everything's in high detail, and watching it in 4K was just amazing.
And a real quick anecdote based off of that, it was very detailed, and that made the actual TV release of this anime a nightmare. Episodes were constantly getting delayed. They had to keep cutting things. I'm glad that I experienced this as a film with everything touched up and cleaned up and done as one cohesive thing. It sounds like the original Macross show would have been not nearly as enjoyable on TV, just because it was such a hard thing to draw.
Yeah, I've watched, I've gone back and I've started to watch the original episodes. Right, fun, right? And it's a stark contrast, right? You were looking at here is your TV quality. Hey, we're here to create a serialized episode. Boom, boom, boom. We need one coming out every week to move the story along and sell some toys, right? And there is a dip in the animation quality. It's still great, right? Not bad animation, but definitely you can start to see the reusing of scenes. You can start to see, slightly less detail, but still they really focus on when you are having these battle scenes, right? There is still a crazy amount of detail, even when you're drilling it down. They tend to reuse those scenes over and over, but they're really cool scenes, right? And if you're not watching them back to back on YouTube, it's not as possible, right? So as a kid in the 80s watching it and you're tuning in, you're just excited to see that awesome, crazy battle scene again, even if it was the one that you saw last week, because you're not even.
So are you saying that kids are just getting entertainment wrong now that everything's streaming and we can binge everything? Are you saying that we are ruining the quality of life for the children in this country?
It's not ruined. It's just different, right? It's just different. I'm not going to complain, because I love the fact that I can watch 8 episodes of like the new He-Man cartoon, right, and watch them all back to back in a lazy Sunday, right? That's fine.
Yeah,
So,
well,
it's just different.
well, fine. Don't let me take things to ridiculous proportions then. Fine, be your logical, sensible self and talking about the golden age that we live in. Brian, you want to talk about some gigantic missiles or what?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that always sticks in my mind about this series is the amount of missiles that come out of any of these jets, and they do it like 80 times. So I'm assuming the missile to jet ratio is like these jets are composed of 90% missiles, or they're manufacturing them within the jet. I don't understand how the physics works, but like it's those wild like trails all over, and then things blow up. It's the music, right, John? It's that wild, jazzy, goofy, like I guess you would say it's extra. It's just way too extra for like whatever the scene is. The music is way too much for what is happening in the current scene. When they're like running through the town on their date, I'm just like, this is like a full-on like jazz ensemble losing their mind on LSD. It's like, what are we doing here as a unit? On top of that,
one second there, Brian. Let's pause for 1 second there. I never got the feeling the music was too much. I thought it mostly fit the moods really well. So, John, you want to be an arbiter there? Are you more on the excess or more well-played side?
I think the music is, and I think I would agree with you, Tom. I don't think it's too much, right? I think it's a stark difference, right? And I think I can see where it could be too much. Someone when you're coming from like they just had this military scene with these big giant like monsters going culture keys, right, talking, and then all of a sudden you're jumping over and there's big shifts, right? But what kept bringing me back in, I'm like, this is an 80s movie, and I kept going to Top Gun and to like these big bombastic like action movies that had these huge romantic stories, and they would do the same things just with like different music stylings, like Take My Breath Away, right, in like Top Gun, these like big huge like love sweeping songs in like all of our American 80s movies. I think it's just a difference of like, this is what the like pop culture, that type of music for like the type of singer Min-May was. That's what was popular in that time for Japan.
It's also interesting, like the big final battle scene is done to this sappy, slow love pop song. These ships are blowing up. There's mechs flying all over. Heads are getting crushed. Oh, I saw your eyes across the room. It's just like, what are you doing?
It was an ancient song. It was beautiful, Brian. My most recent frame of reference for 80s movies is video game movies, because we did that show just a couple of years ago, and like I thought about those movies as we were watching Macross, Do You Remember Love? And I'm like, wow, I wish that I just like watch more anime films and like crappy old 80s films, because like I'm not saying that this film holds up perfectly today in this day and age, but having never seen it before, I'm like, oh man, this is awesome. I want more of this. Like, I wish I'd watched this 30 years ago.
To wrap up my thoughts, what I would say, the last two things that I think are interesting is the fact they've got an absolute Richard of a character named Roy Fokker. Roy Fokker is what they chose to be this jerk's name that commits sexual assault at one point in a club. And then finally, this was the part that is actually interesting, though, is that Japan has this big kind of idol anime genre where it's kind of like younger teens or early 20s. It can be boys or girls, but where they kind of like are anime characters and they're very close to their like fans. And this is considered to be one of the earliest versions of the idol kind of genre being built into anime. And that's actually a wildly popular and extremely lucrative thing now. It's wildly lucrative, but this is one of the first versions of it, and it happens to be in Macross.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Staying on a cultural note, one thing that stood out to me, especially comparing this to Shogun, which we just talked about on the last episode with Brian and Joey and me, I didn't feel any major cultural shifts in this. Like, we talked a lot in Shogun about how different Japanese culture was and their disregard for human life. I felt like Macross could have been like could have come out of any civilization. It could have been American, it could have been Canadian, it could have been like from anywhere. Like, I didn't see any elements of Japanese culture. Do you guys agree with that point?
I would. I mean, for the most part, it's a very progressive future. Star Trekky, maybe not quite as diplomatic kind of future, but it's a future where like basically, you know, humans are roving the universe. And I think that when you kind of get away from the caste system of certain kinds of societies, you kind of eliminate a lot of that, oh, you screwed up, die.
Yeah, I'm glad we moved past the you screwed up, die, or you spoke out a turn, die. Like, man, Shogun was really dark, man. One of the things that stood out to me from the film were the situations that the main character Hikaru found himself in. Like, at one point, he gets marooned with Minmay and they fall in love. Then he gets marooned with the officer and they fall in love. And, like, those storylines aside, I think that getting marooned, this is a space opera. It's this big epic thing taking place on space. And Hikaru and the officer wind up getting shut off somewhere. They don't know exactly where they're stranded. They're exploring around and then they realize that they're on freaking Earth and it is a wasteland. And, like, I'm like, that's an interesting place to take a space opera. And that was one of the elements that stood out to me, was just wandering around Rune Earth as the only two people on the planet for a month. And I keep thinking about it, like, how depressing that would be to be literally one of the last two people on Earth.
Yeah, I think that, again, this movie is about pushing love, kind of, you know, creating these areas where, like, you know, love can flourish in these crazy ways, right? And yeah, you know, that moment in the movie is like, to me, when they realize it's Earth, and then like, but like everything is destroyed, right? And they're all by themselves. How are we going to survive? It's such like a powerful shift in the movie, and I love how then it also gets tied into the idea of culture and love and everything throughout the rest of the film to like bring it to conclusion.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Love is kind of what actually solves the main problem. You've got two warring factions for 500,000 years, and it's love that essentially winds up ending it. But then you also see the ramifications of like where love can be a problem. But the marooning stuff was funny too, because like early on there's that brief nudity scene which just felt completely out of place. Like, oh, well, we're floating around the engine room. Let's take a shower. Let's show her naked and moving on. And it's like, wait, what? I remember as a kid being confused by that too.
So it's actually in like, so again, so the movie itself is just a condensed version of like the entire anime, right? So if you watch Macross the anime, by about episode 6, right, kind of the same thing happens where Minmay and Hikaru get lost in the big ship, right? It happens in a different way, but they get lost and they spend like a week together. And then like he sets up a shower for her eventually, right? She's like, oh, like they find water and like he busts a pipe and it gets all over, like, oh, there's water. And she's like, I think I'm going to take a shower. So he sets it up for her and they do the same thing, right? And but it's kind of, it's played a little bit different, right? Because it's a little bit like, it's like, no, you go away, like don't look, don't peek, right? Like, you know, and then he's like cute because he brings her his clothes and this and that. So it's I think it's just like, it was one of those things where I think they're like, look, we got to throw this. If we don't put the naked chick in here, she was in the other series, people are going to be like, where's Naked Man? Huh? What is going on? And like,
I'm not buying toys.
Right? You guys had it in the TV show. It needs to be here in this, right? And I do think that like that is one of the things that like kind of does stand out, right, from a culture standpoint. Like that would not have happened in like, I mean, that wasn't in the Robotech episode, right? So it was interesting to see how some of those things shifted from the TV series. And
well, now that John has explained why the gratuitous nudity was essential for this film's success, let's talk about the directors. This film had 2 directors, and they each played a significant role in the success of the film. It paired youthful visionary mech creator Shoji Kawamari and veteran director Noboru Ishiguro. Kawamari reimagined the Valkyries, expanded the world building, and provided cinematic direction. Ishiguro created a grand, operatic feel, provided masterful pacing, and integrated music throughout the film. Together, they showed mecha movies could grow beyond TV recap films into something stunning, emotionally deep, and narratively rich. What was a specific scene from the film that provided an emotional punch, Brian?
For me, I mean, there's a lot of different relationship parts that you could draw from. I think for me, it's actually kind of the end conflict when you've got two groups that are like utterly committing genocide onto one another. And as goofy as it is to have that song at the end be the background for this epic fight, um, it's it makes the two warring alien races remember kind of like there was a connection there. So these two races were separated eventually because these proto humans, these proto culture, these creatures before humans, they created two large races, one male, one female, and they went to war with each other because they could make their own offspring. They kind of separated themselves and they went to war, and it's bringing everybody back and kind of realizing the enemy is actually something that wants to obliterate them all, but they can do something better together. I thought it was kind of cool how they tie everybody together with this love theme that is absolutely entwined through everything else. So that was probably what I thought the most. As goofy as it was, I thought it was actually kind of heartfelt there at the end.
Yeah, and for me, there's a moment, we talk about like, when Hayase and Hikaru are back on Earth. And there's a moment there where they're exploring the ruins. Hikaru goes off. They found like some like old apartment. And Hayase is, she's picking up and she's seeing all these dishes and seeing like the normalcy, like someone lived here, right? And then she's like pouring water for her. And when Hikaru comes back, right, there's a whole dinner set, right? There's no food, right? But she's made the table. And it's this like normal moment, and they sit down and they like play house, right? And they're like, we're just gonna have this normal moment together and like have a meal, and it's really really sweet. And then all of a sudden, like there's a gut punch. Hayase like just like she's like, we're alone, right? We're all alone. No one's coming for us, right? And what are we gonna do, right? And she's like, she just breaks. And you can see right there, and there's this moment where that's where Hikaru's like, no, I'm gonna protect someone, and like he just kind of stands up and like they come together. And to me, like the three different stages of that moment was like just such an amazing part of the movie, just because like of how it's drawn, how it's paced, right? The different emotions they feel, and like the score, and like there's like 10 words in the entire scene, and it was just beautifully done.
Well, I think it's interesting how we're all coming in on different ends of the spectrum here, because Brian's got the big space battle in the climax of the film, and John's got this quiet moment between two of the main characters and how that scene evolves. For me, it's not a specific scene, but it was the overall love triangle. So Hikaru and Minmay wind up isolated, and they fall in love. And then Hikaru and Hayase end up isolated on Earth, and they fall in love. And in the end, Ikaru and Hayase end up together, and Minmay's left out in the cold. And it's like, she didn't do anything wrong. Like, I felt really bad that she got such a raw deal.
It's really interesting with Hikaru and Minmay as well, because like he was a crush. She was his celebrity crush. And like when you actually see a scene of his apartment later, he has a poster of her up on the wall. He's who she falls in love with, and then he gets rid of her.
It's like getting stranded with Taylor Swift, right? And then like Taylor Swift falling in love with you, and then you're just saying like, oh, well, I'm gonna stick with this office thing here. Like, yeah, no thanks, Tay-Tay.
I don't know. To be honest, I would agree with no Taylor Swift, but that's just me.
I think it's two different relationships, right? And I think that's why it's so interesting, right? And it shows Hikaru's growth, right? And there's this difference in like, okay, hey, we got stuck together, and it's big infatuation, and I'm gonna go ahead and like do all these crazy things because Roy Fokker said, "Be a man, go grab her," right? And he's like stealing her away, and going to like put her in the plane and going to Jupiter and all this sort of craziness, right? Breaking the rules for this girl, because it's Minmay. He says it all the time. Oh, Minmay. And I think when they actually crash though, and he's now on this planet with Hayase, it's a different thing where he's just like, oh, I was just infatuated with the celebrity, this girl who was a poster on my wall, right, and didn't know her, and like now here's this person that I actually truly care for, right? And like there's no glitz, there's no glamour, there's no big, we're at like the hollow thing and it's fun, right? And like, oh look, we're playing, like, actually just click, like they play to get married, right? Like they're in the hollow thing and they have the wedding gowns, and like, so that versus like, this other idea of like, I'm gonna be with this person and I'll be here even if no one else shows up. So it's a completely like, I'm putting away this infatuation and like picking this person that I care about for real.
And Hayase at one point almost tries to kill herself. She stops eating and she's just going to lay there and die, and he does not allow her to do so. So you kind of get this bonding almost through trauma that's infinitely deeper than just the girl on the poster on the wall.
Yeah, and that's interesting. The overall evolution of the relationships reflects Hikaru's growth as a character, right? So like he has the infatuation, he's doing dumb things, they get captured, he goes on this adventure, and then like at the end, Minmay appeals to him. There's a scene where they end up alone together on Macross, and she needs to do her part to end the war, and Hikaru tries to get her to do that, and she's like, everyone else can just die. Let's just stay here, just the two of us. Everyone else can die. And he smacks her, which I do not condone laying hands on anyone, especially not a woman, but I thought that was a powerful moment because that was him trying to get through to her and saying, people that I care about have already died, and like this matters. So like you need to do this so that everyone else dying is a calamity, a catastrophe, and like snap out of it. We're alive, and so we have to fulfill our duty, basically. And I thought that was just a really strong moment towards the end of the movie.
A little bit different than their date day.
I think it's really cool too how, Hayase find, like, the part of this whole thing is they find, this music that messes up the Zentradi, right? They're like, oh my gosh, it distracts them, this and that. And they're trying to like write lyrics for it, right? So that Minmay can sing these lyrics. And no one puts together like, oh, this is like this old signal from, the protoculture people, right? And then all of a sudden, like, Hayase had found like this, like just some lyrics that were written in that house they were in. She realizes it's the actual words to the song, right? Because she's like singing, and she puts herself out there too to be like, okay, I'm gonna actually bring this to Min. And like I don't know, just I love how they brought that together. It was kind of predictable, and you're gonna see like, oh, those are gonna be, it's important later on. But I loved how that was tied together, and then like everybody, like you said, kind of had to like get over it, like go save the people, and whether Hikaru picks me or Minmay, I have to get these lyrics to save everybody.
Yeah, everyone has to step outside of their comfort zone to do their duty. Ryan, given that this film is nearly 40 years old, how well does it hold up in 2025? Are there a lot of rough spots?
I think we're all going to have the same theme. It's kind of hard how some of the dialogue that was directed at the female characters, like, it is derogatory. I mean, at one point, the main character just looks to the commander who's going to be his future girlfriend, and she gives him a direct order. This is his commander. And he goes, I'm not going to listen to you. You're a woman. And like flies off. And it's just like, that's not how the military works. At one point, Roy Fokker essentially goes, oh, you just take a woman. And he grabs this woman and kind of like, she's kind of resisting him. And he like forces himself on her, which is kind of just gross. And at one point too, at the end there, when Minmay gets slapped, and then she thanks Hikaru for it. She's like, oh, thank you. And it's like he like just whapped her in the face. Oh, thank you. That really helped me. I'm like, what's going on here? Like, that probably didn't age so well. And there's a lot of things in the 80s, particularly the mid 80s, late 80s, early 80s that didn't really age well. But that kind of stuff was almost distracting. I don't know if you guys took it as distracting, but it was just like, what is going on?
Yeah, I'd agree. That's the one thing that was, like, I wrote down in my notes too, where, man, why is this here, right? And I don't know if that was, obviously the 80s were different, but those things definitely stood out, and you see it in other things too, right? Like, the men Zentradi are these big, brutish, ugly, like they are gnarly looking weird dudes, right? but their female counterparts are beautiful, right? It is like they were drawn super beautiful, and like Max, Max the American, but I forget what his name is in the Japanese, but he even like when he sees them for the first time, he's like, oh wow, so beautiful, right? They're so beautiful, oh my gosh. And I'm like, why does that have to be a thing, right? So it is interesting how those things played out, and like they're not integral to so it'd be great if they weren't there.
Yeah, agreed. I don't really have anything to add on top of that. Moving away from misogyny, I think the film still looks awesome. Like, the hand-drawn style still looks really cool. Like, it's still a good-looking film in 2025. So is this, John, a film that people can still enjoy? Like, assuming the dozens of people that listen to this episode log right off and jump onto YouTube to watch a pirated copy, are they going to enjoy Macross, Do You Remember Love?
If you have an affinity for anime, I'd check it out, right? It's still a great movie. If you can get past a couple of those rough spots for its age, it's just a great part of animation history. It's a great time capsule for like the 80s when we had like that Top Gun era, when aviation and like, you know, fighter jets and all that was just so huge. I'd recommend it. And the movie holds up. Like, it makes an impact, right? And the story and the love triangle is great, and the action is great. So to me, it's a win.
Right, guy?
I think it holds up pretty well. Just from the animation style, like John mentioned, it's gorgeous. The 4K version on YouTube was like beautiful, and I was watching like a VHS dupe prior to that, so like this was like eye-bleeding gorgeous. But I think that the love triangle is interesting enough where like you can see the positive qualities of everybody involved in it. And you would be kind of happy if it wound up in either direction. So, you know, unfortunately, when it's a triangle, you know, one of those sides, one of those angles is going to get left out. And in this one, it's Minmay, and you feel for her at the end because, like, she has to go on. She had fallen in love with someone, and she just has to go back to that kind of lonely life she talked about of being a pop star. And you kind of feel for her.
Yeah, Team Minmay for the win. As someone who had not watched a lot of anime and had never seen this film before, just watching it for the first time, I thought it was phenomenal. Like, I would put it on a par. You guys are going to crucify me for this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to put it on par with Star Wars. Like, as a cultural reference for that time frame, like, I think it is as important to anime as Star Wars is to American film.
I see that. I'm not going to crucify you for that. I think that's a very, very, like, you're spot on.
All right, I'm smart. Brian, you had a very distasteful look on your face.
I'm not going to crucify you. Well, here's where I do agree with you is that this anime was one of the big steps of moving mechs away from kids' toys to something more adult with more adult themes. And in that regard, I can see that being an absolutely monstrously critical step, because you're moving away from toy lines and those kinds of things driving the storylines to something that is far more adult. And that itself was a very large step. So I won't crucify you. I may not 100% agree with you, but I agree with you more than I disagree with you.
And let me frame it this way, as if you're somebody who's interested in the history of nerd pop culture, like, this is a big stepping stone for anime. So if you have any passing interest in anime and want to know, like, where it came from, this is the launching point. This is something that you must watch if you're interested in the history of nerd pop culture. Fair?
Fair.
Awesome. So we're going to move on to other mech media in just a moment, but first we're going to say a quick word to our sponsor, from our sponsor, for our sponsor.
So guys, one day I'm a simple pilot doing air shows in my small town, and the next thing you know, I'm doing 0G turns, crashing through walls, and traveling through space. One thing they don't warn you about all this, though, is how Spacefold will wreak havoc on your lower back. Any ideas on how I can get fixed up so I can get back out to battling the Zentradi?
Absolutely. And before I tell you exactly how to fix yourself up, like, I love that moment when you tell your buddy that he's a murderer for all the planes that he shot down in the war. Like, that was a great little moment. I applaud you for standing up for advocating for not taking human life. But in regards to your lower back and all of the injuries, you should check out Premier Health. They have solutions for back pain, neck pain, car accidents, Zentradi-related injuries, and more. We suggest seeing Dr. Brian Camille in Golden Valley, Minnesota, or Dr. Kelsey Camille in Coon Rapids. Learn more at premierhealthmn.com. That's premierhealthmn as in Minnesota.com. Now that we've established that mechs have the potential to pack an emotional punch, let's close out the show by discussing some other mech media. First question, and I'll point it to Brian first. Why do you think mechs have captured the imagination of so many for so long?
I mean, they're gigantic mechanized weapons that have a million different attacks. They're doing battle with other gigantic weapons and space mutants and aliens, and you're killing things. And sometimes to be entertained, I don't always feel like something has to have a deeper meaning, right? It just doesn't. I love Pacific Rim because it's just visually a feast to watch, and sometimes that's just enough. And I think that's kind of where mechs fall into it, right? It's just it's just cool to take in the spectacle and just enjoy it for what it is. And I really appreciate about this genre.
Also, I'm going to push back real quick. Like, I think Pacific Rim is a terrific film, and I think it is more than just like a visual splendor. Like, I think that is a wonderful film that, again, every like nerd should watch. John, why do you think that mechs capture the imagination so effectively?
I think they're just such a more approachable, like, superhero power, right? Like, I don't have to be an alien. I don't have to have these superpowers to fly or, this unrealistic thing, but I can climb into the cockpit of like this giant machine, and then I can do something extraordinary, fight monsters or aliens or other robots, right? So it's just, I can put myself in that really easy, and I think that's really attractive to.
Well, real talk here for a second. Now, John, in your heart of hearts, would you truly rather climb up into a mech and like fly this big space thing around and then eventually get out and like go back to your daily life? Or would you rather be bitten by a radioactive spider and just have those powers always and forever?
Spider-Man's always the win. Right? So, yes, like, it is awesome to think about being a superhero and to play a Spider-Man game, but I think these things, like, I don't know, it's just another avenue for that same sort of like power. Think about, one of the OG moments is like Ripley and Alien, right? Like being able to like I'm in this mech and I can take down this big nasty thing, and it's it's just a mechanized loader. It wasn't even this big giant thing, and it's just, I don't know, it's just a different avenue.
And I don't feel it's as big as a jump as like Spider-Man. You don't know anybody that can stick to walls and shoot webs and swing around.
Well, you don't know anybody that flies a giant robot either.
Humans are building currently exoskeletons that are letting people that are paraplegic walk. So at least this is less of a jump than what you're talking about with Spider-Man.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a big mech guy, so like to me, it's just like entering a cheat code in a game. It's like, oh, instant power up, and like now I can do all these things that I wasn't intended to do as a human being. So, like, and I get that that's appealing to a lot of people. It's not really my cup of tea. So once our legions of listeners have consumed Do You Remember Love, what mech content should they consume next?
I say go Voltron. Go to Netflix. There's a great like reimagining, like remake of it they did there, and I personally love it. It's great. The animation's great. It's super fun. I would also recommend everyone watch Robot Jocks, which is a live action like 80s like thing, like it's hard to describe, like think Rocky but with like mechs, and it is amazing. It is like just such a B movie, but like just please go watch it. It's awesome.
It's odd that you brought that up, John, because I watched that literally 2 months ago on Amazon Prime. I had a sick day and it was on Prime, and I was like, this is the movie that I looked at all the time. It was worth the wait. It's the 80s. There's an 80s aesthetic. There's an 80s feel, and it just kind of encapsulates that, right, where everything's just kind of like bigger than life. So that is one I would highly recommend. The one that I would recommend is Neon Genesis Evangelion. It came out in 1995. Of all the stuff that we have talked about when it comes to mechs and stuff like that, that series, to be honest, actually just in every way. It shifted anime in an entirely new way, not just like the mechs, like all of it. It when Tom, you said earlier, like, hey, this is kind of like, this movie is almost like the Star Wars of Japan. This is the Star Wars of Japan. Neon Genesis Evangelion is the most lucrative, and it's not even close, media genre in Japan. Like, they paint trains like the mechs. It was culturally shifting. So if that is not one that you have seen, it also deals wildly with different kinds of aspects of like the mind and how we can break down and things like that. It just goes way beyond just what you're seeing from the battle standpoint. But it completely altered how this stuff works. And I would say that mechs really haven't gone back to the way they were before since it came out.
I would just warn our listeners before you dive into Evangelion, like, it is a crazy head trip, and like there's some great mech stuff in it, but like if you want like action and like robot jocks, like gladiators beating it out, not for you. If you want to like be really like have that aspect, but then also like be really engaged and like be thinking about like, you know, man's place on the earth and why I'm here and like a soul and like all these sorts of things, that's all the stuff that's going to be in there too. So just be ready for that. It's not a bombastic like Dragon Ball Z Gundam fight thing. It is really, really heavy.
It's super interesting too, because the director had actually been going through a whole bunch of psychological issues, and you can see how it just bled into the storylines. It was fascinating that way, and it is a mind trip. John's not kidding.
That sounds awesome. Like, I am legitimately going to go watch Neon Genesis Evangelion at some point. So John had 80s action film RoboJocks. Brian had more contemporary, like 90s anime, psycho, pseudo-thriller Neon Genesis Evangelion. I took a more mainstream approach with Pacific Rim, because I love Pacific Rim. Now, granted, it's
awesome
been
movie.
8-ish years since I've actually watched it. It is a visual splendor, like Brian said, but I have always had an affinity for the film because the main character deals with loss. His like military commander, he has dealt with loss in his background. The insurmountable threat of the kaiju coming up through the ocean at an increased rate, getting stronger and stronger. It's just, I love the tension in the film. I love the two scientists and the comedy that they bring to the film, and I just love the main character's ability to overcome his own personal loss to rise to the moment. And I love Pacific Rim. I think that everything they've done after the original Pacific Rim with that title has been garbage. But the original film is awesome, and it's a film that I could go back to again and again and again and again.
Tom, that movie killed me because when we watched it, Kelsey and I had no expectations. We're just like, oh, it's going to be mechs fighting. Between the music, the storyline, it was so much better than I thought it would be. And you're right. I know that they made a second one with Finn from Star Wars, which was trash. I don't know if they've gone past that, but the first is certainly worth a watch.
I think they did an animated film, and I believe I've watched it, but it was very forgettable. I think I've watched it in the last 3 years, and I remember nothing about it.
Okay.
But first one, still a classic. So last question for you guys. Outside of your contractual obligation to play Armored Core, what's the next piece of mech content you are likely to consume?
Evangelion for me. I told Kelsey about it and just kind of how the show works. And she was highly interested. So we're just finishing up Arcane Season 2. It took her a second to get into that, but she ripped through all that content. And I think we're going to take a step towards that. And I told her it's big mechs and a little bit of psychological thriller. And she's like, oh, it sounds good, but I'm not going to tell her anything else and just let her kind of discover what that is as it goes.
Should have her start writing a diary to decompress after every episode, man. It's like, I don't want to scare people off, but it's heavy stuff. And maybe it's because, I probably watched it when I was in high school or, early college again, right? So, watching it as a 40-year-old man, I might be a little bit easier to take. Or who knows, maybe I'll have an even bigger existential crisis and, completely melt down if I watch it today.
Yeah, well, you haven't scared me off, John. That's going to be the next thing that I watch. I originally thought it was going to be more Macross, but I think I really have to check out Neon Genesis.
I think that, now having watched some of this older stuff with Macross and like rekindling that, one thing I want to look at is going even earlier, and I want to check out Gundam, right? Like, I hear great stuff about Gundam here and there, and I just kind of want to see that, and it's a little bit more of that, like, militaristic, like, I think there's like some love triangle stuff, romance. I don't know. I just want to get into it. I've always I see the Gundam models every time, like, I'm with the family at like a hobby store, like we go to Joanne, right? And this, that, and like, I'm gonna go to the model section. And I'm like, I should get that'd be fun. So maybe I'll do that and build a model.
Yeah, that'd be pretty rad, not red. For the next 2 months, our game club is playing Armored Core 6, Fires of the Rubicon. John, I know you wrapped up Ghost of Tsushima, and you've been playing some Fires of the Rubicon. What are your first early impressions of it?
It's awesome. I'm almost through Chapter 1. I am super hooked. The combat is fast and frenetic. It make you really feel like you're in a mech. But it's really customizable. So like if you're like, I like to go in and be really quick and fast, you can do that. You can build big tanky mechs with like wheels, right? Like they're tank treads. So I don't know. It's a lot of fun so far. It's kind of gives me also like a Shadow of Colossus vibe a little bit, with like some of these giant, massive like mech things that like you're fighting one boss, you're climbing on the boss and this and that. So it's been a lot of fun so far.
And Brian, I think this is accurate, but you tend to be a little up and down on FromSoft games. You loved Elden Ring, you hated Demon Souls. What is your level of interest in Armored Core 6?
Much more. I mean, I have enjoyed FromSoft more than I have disliked it. So there's that. But what I do know is that generally speaking, they put a lot of care into their games. It's super clear that they put things together in a way that is thoughtful for the most part. I think I struggled with Demon Souls just because it was so much older. It was just felt clunky. But I mean, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, Sekiro, I mean, these are all really, really fun games. So I'm very, I think I maybe have done like 2 missions. It's been very early for me, but I'm almost overwhelmed when I'm looking at the customization that you can do. Like I'm getting like paralysis by analysis. So this is going to be interesting to see how I handle this.
And just wait until like they take the guardrails off the customization. Like, it is super intimidating. I've played a little bit on Xbox. I think I played the first couple of chapters, and I really, really enjoyed it. I'm restarting on PlayStation for the show. My concern is that it's going to be too hard for me, and like I won't be able to figure out the builds, and like I'm worried about the fun to frustration ratio on it. Like, I know I'm very excited to jump into it. I have trepidation about my own like skill.
My recommendation to everyone: YouTube.
Find out,
like, watch. The first thing you do is like, hey, whenever I start a new game, especially a FromSoft game, I say 10 things that I wish I would have known before I started game. I always watch those because you get all kinds of great like tips and tricks about like, go buy a shield right away and use the shield because it's important. Use your melee combat and this and that. So I've already found out a lot of those, like, oh, this has made it easier. And I, for one, am going to be the first person that's just going to go, give me the build, right, that works for this. And then, like, okay, I want a blueprint. Now I can tweak it a little because I don't need to have the super minor minutia. I'm like, I like machine guns. Okay, what's the best machine gun? Great, we'll give me that one. I like these rockets. Okay, I want a shield and I want a sword. I'm good, right? Now let me go blow some stuff up.
Yeah, and I'm going to tinker and tweak everything and just try to figure it out on my own, because that's how I get my dopamine. It's like, oh, I overcame this challenge that I thought was insurmountable. Great, I am so smart.
I'm more like John, and Casey's this way too. We've talked about that before. It's like I will do my research before because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I just don't. I'd rather have an idea going in so that I can make sure that I am being efficient with my time. There's certainly games that I go in blind, but this is not going to be one of them. Like, I've already watched some things. I watched a video that was 40 minutes long at one point. I don't remember all of it, but I watched a 40-minute video on weapons alone.
Well, I look forward to being wildly inefficient. So for the next 2 months, we're playing Armored Core 6, Fires of the Rubicon on Game Club. That'll be in this main OiO podcast feed. Next month on the main show, we'll tackle mechs in a whole new way with digital board games like Scythe. Can strategy games capture the mech magic? We'll find out and we'll discuss it next month. Thank you for listening to Outside is Overrated. Please review us on your favorite podcast platform and consider supporting our show on Patreon at patreon.com/OiO. For John Munch and for Brian's Monster Ding Dong, I'm Thompson Logic at Thompson Logic OiO. We'll talk to you next month. Stay inside, kids.